welcome to Tube of Toons. I am Luke, and in today's very special Halloween episode of The Myth Behind the Monsters, we shall be looking at Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman. The myth behind the monsters. Okay, so enough of that accent, but like I did say, this is the Halloween special for the myth behind the monsters. Now, it's not doing any like Halloween special episode of Scooby-Doo. We are actually just carrying on with, we're covering episode 11 of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? And it just so happens that the monsters this week perfectly tied into the fact that it is Halloween tomorrow. So why not just go all out and make this like a Halloween-y episode? Now, we did take a bit of a break from Scooby-Doo. Of course, last week's episode was for the 60th anniversary of the Flintstones. So if you haven't seen that one yet, go check it out. We looked at the Gorillasaurus. It's a pretty unique monster that you never really see on Scooby-Doo, so it's certainly a lot of fun to check out. But back in Scooby-Doo, well, this whole gaggle of galloping ghosts first appeared in the 11th episode of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? A Gaggle of Galloping Ghosts. On their way to Frankencastle, the gang stop and see a fortune teller. The gypsy warns them away from the castle, telling them that the caretaker left early. When they get to the castle, Dracula is waiting for them at the drawbridge, but Daphne gets trapped on the other side and is chased by Frankenstein's monster. Scooby and Shaggy swing over the moat, probably using those gymnastic skills, only to be chased by the Wolfman after letting down the bridge. Whilst running from him, Scooby disguises himself as the Black Knight Ghost. Oh, it's just a regular suit of armour. They manage to capture him, Freddy would be proud, and then run away without unmasking him. Maybe not. Speaking of Fred, he and Velma watch as Dracula turns into a bat, causing Velma to lose her glasses and fall down a trapdoor.
Hey, my glasses! I can't see without them!
In the kitchen, Scooby and Shaggy run into Frankenstein's monster and are chased down to the torture chamber, where they find Velma. They hear Daphne calling out from the dungeon and help rescue her from Dracula. And then they trap him in the dungeon, and again they fail to unmask him. What? Has Fred taught you guys nothing? Scooby and Shaggy become separated from the girls, who run back into Fred, as Daphne tells them what clue she has discovered while trapped. A note was written on the castle wall in 1668, hinting to a treasure as big as King Tut, ignoring the fact that Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't discovered until 1922. But more on that in the next episode. Scooby and Shaggy find themselves in Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory, and after messing about they scare off the Wolfman and narrowly escape Frankenstein's monster. After regrouping, the gang head to the Franken family crypt and discover Dracula sleeping in the tomb. Shaggy and Scooby use the tapestry to trap Dracula in the tomb, and when Fred goes to open the tomb to take the mask off, he's vanished. However, an earring that is left behind leads them back to the gypsy wagon, where they find, spoiler alert for a 50-year-old episode, that she has the jewel embroidered tapestry on her, meaning the gypsy was really Dracula. When she attempts to run away, she gives chase to Scooby, who corners her with an oncoming police car. The sheriff tells them that he's really Big Bob Oakley, the actor, who's a master of disguise. He'd dressed up as not only the gypsy, as well as the monsters in Frankencastle, to scare people away while he looks for the Franken jewels, which had been woven into the tapestry. So this episode actually has 3 monsters, and they're the 3 big Halloween staples: Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman. So what are they? What can they do? Dracula is a vampire who appears to sleep in a tomb and is capable of completely vanishing and turning into a bat. The Frankenstein monster is seen in the laboratory, hinting that he was a creation of the scientist who once owned it. And the Wolfman is a werewolf-like man who we see lurking around in the light of the full moon. There isn't really a hint that he's a man that's turned into a wolf, since we only see him in his like wolf form, but one can assume he's the Wolfman considering the company he keeps. Now, there is a 4th disguise in the episode of a gypsy fortune teller, but this isn't really a monster, and since gypsies are a real life group of people, I decided not to cover them here. Plus, we certainly have enough to cover with the 3 actual monsters from the episode. This is the part where I remind you to like the video. It really helps out the channel and allows me to keep bringing more spooky myths at you. If you've not done so yet, hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell to be notified the next time there's a monster on the loose. So the 3 monsters aren't just 3 of the more iconic monsters of all time. They all happen to be 3 of the bigger Universal monsters that appeared in Universal Studios monster movies throughout the 1930s and 40s. As we previously mentioned, the Universal monsters started in 1925 with the Phantom of the Opera. Although some consider the Hunchback of Notre Dame in 23 to have kicked off the series, although this isn't really a horror movie. Throughout the rest of the decade, they had some small successes with horror, but it wasn't until 1931 that they introduced us to both Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. Dracula is a book that was first released by Bram Stoker in 1892. It was unofficially adapted into a German film in 1922 titled Nosferatu, and then it was adapted into a play in 1924, which underwent a Broadway revision in 1927. In 1931, Universal opted to buy the rights to make a film officially, using the Broadway revision as much of the film's basis, however drawing some inspiration from Nosferatu. Dracula in the film is iconically played by Bela Lugosi, and I personally think he was the greatest part of the film. The Dracula franchise would then continue without Dracula himself, choosing instead to focus on his still living offspring that weren't featured in the original film. In Dracula's Daughter in 1936, and Son of Dracula in 1943. In 1818, Mary Shelley released her novel Frankenstein, or Monster Prometheus, debuting her original creation, The Monster. Universal chose to adapt the book also in 1931, starring Boris Karloff as the monster. The film was heavily stylized, creating an incredibly spooky atmosphere with its gothic sets. The Frankenstein series would continue on with The Bride of Frankenstein 1935 and The Son of Frankenstein 1939, both of which continued the story with Karloff remaining in his role as the monster, and The Ghost of Frankenstein 1942, which again was a continuation of the story, but with Lon Chaney Jr. taking over the role as Frankenstein's monster with Karloff on Broadway. While werewolves have been around in folklore for many years, they were traditionally depicted as men who would turn into wolves, as opposed to a wolf-man hybrid. This was an idea that seems to have come from cinema. Universal's first werewolf movie, which was the first mainstream werewolf movie, was released in 1935, Werewolves of London. Now we can delve more into the history of werewolves when we start to take a look at this guy, but for now let's have a look at these films more closely. Now this film is interesting as it seems to introduce the idea of a werewolf bite transmitting the curse, as well as turning into a werewolf when the moon is full. Although it appears to be over a few night period when the moon looks full, rather than just the one singular night when it truly is full. However, the film is fairly minimal on the spooky elements, being that much like Dracula, it is a film that starts off in a foreign land, be it Transylvania or Tibet, and then takes the action back to London, where much of the film takes place in the rather dull British high society. In 1941, Universal would go on to produce another werewolf movie, The Wolfman, with Lon Chaney starring as Larry Talbot, the man who would transform into the Wolfman. The film contains numerous references to both wolfsbane and silver, both things taken from real-life werewolf folklore, and it firmly plants the idea of a silver bullet being the weapon of choice to kill werewolves in media. Despite being more far removed from the original Dracula and Frankenstein movies, it appears that this later film is the more direct influence for the Scooby episode. For instance, the makeup is more wolfish in appearance, and much like Frankenstein, the setting is more dramatic and stylized, giving off a much more spooky atmosphere. One of the most notable things in the movie, however, is the role played by a gypsy woman, who at the start is seen with a car almost exactly the same as the one in the episode. She is seen to be warning Larry of his coming lycanthropy, much like how the gypsy in the episode attempts to warn away the gang from the castle. And it would be this version of the character as well that would go on to cross over with the monster and Dracula. And did I say crossover? Yeah, I did, because the Universal monsters were the very first cinematic universe. The first crossover would be in 1943's The Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, featuring the two titular characters. Well, he's Frankenstein's monster, not Frankenstein, but you get what they mean. Which would then be followed by House of Frankenstein 1944 and House of Dracula 1945, where Dracula would join them to create the infamous trio that we see in the episode. So what do these films from the 30s and 40s have to do with a Scooby-Doo episode released in 1969? Well, these films are incredibly iconic and would be shown on the Shock Theatre movie block and the later Creature feature blocks that would air in syndication throughout the 50s and 60s. The late night feature showings on television would solidify the monsters into the public consciousness and make them instantly recognisable. In addition to the showing of the original Universal monster movies, Universal would go on to feature them again in the movie Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, a series they would continue with the comedy duo meeting other famous monsters into the 1950s. Throughout the 50s and 60s, many more movies were created featuring the characters since they were in the public domain in the US. Well, at least Dracula and Frankenstein's monster were. The Larry Talbot Wolfman was a copyrighted Universal character, but a more generic werewolf was not. You had American International Pictures produce a series of I Was a Teenage Monster movies. The British Hammer Film Productions made a deal with Universal to feature their characters, or released their versions of the characters in their own movies. They launched a series of films featuring Frankenstein's monster and Dracula, both starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, as well as a series featuring the Mummy, and many one-off films featuring other monsters that Universal had made. The Hammer films were incredibly popular in both Britain and the US, and again served to keep the monsters in the public eye. It makes complete sense then that Scooby-Doo would want to feature the monsters in the show, being that the monsters already had so much spotlight on them. So I think I've mentioned a few times in the video that these three Halloween staples are fairly iconic monsters outside of the show. So of course it makes sense that these three have an iconic status in the franchise, being featured many times over. The Ghost of Grimstone Castle in Scooby-Doo Where Are You issue 10 by Gold Key Comics is a fairly faithful adaptation of the episode, with only minor changes, such as the name of the castle, but most notably, the gypsy here is given the name Carlotta. The costumes for both the Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster appear in Velma's Mystery Museum, leading the gang to the costume shop, where the criminals get their gear in the costume caper, featured in issue 9 of DC Comics Scooby-Doo, as does Charlie the Robot, which I forgot to mention a few weeks back. The Wolfman, Dracula and Frankenstein's monster from the episode all appear in issue 50, Big House Brouhaha, as criminals the gang have previously captured. You've seen this comic before and you'll see it again. The Wolfman is seen in the comic Scooby-Doo Team Up number 22, Nothing is Impossible, where the gang team up with The Impossibles. As part of the Cartoon Network storybook series, the episode was adapted into the children's book Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, A Gaggle of Galloping Ghosts. The Scooby-Doo Mysteries book, Scooby-Doo and the Howling Wolfman, features the Wolfman. The book Scooby-Doo, Scooby-Don't has a similar opening with the gypsy from the episode, warning them about Dracula's castle, with the main monster for the book being Dracula from this episode. The Wolfman appears in Night of 100 Frights. However, the Monster Gallery incorrectly says this is the werewolf from Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf. However, it is clearly the design used for the one found in this episode. In the new Scooby-Doo movies episode, The Exterminator, the designs for Frankenstein's monster and the Wolfman are reused as two of the many monsters in the episode. The design for this version of Dracula is seen in the movie Scooby-Doo and the Goblin King at the bar alongside many other past monsters from the show. Rather than being unfriendly criminals in disguise, however, they are actually real, but friendly. In an episode of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, Fred shows Daphne the trap he used to catch Carlotta the gypsy. But this is pretty interesting, as in the original episode, Fred didn't build any traps. Being the icons that Dracula and Frankenstein's monster are, the gang will come across them many times. However, this is the only time they would encounter someone dressed up as Dracula, and only one of two for Frankie. Every other time would be the undead monsters themselves, appearing together in the new Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo show, the new Scooby-Doo movies, Scooby-Doo and the Ghoul School, Scooby-Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf, a pup named Scooby-Doo, and Shaggy and Scooby-Doo Get a Clue. Werewolves, as well as the non-Dracula vampires, would of course be used various times on the show within the coming years, but they would be more generic and less distinctly based on the Wolfman like the one in this episode. In addition to this, they have all been used in countless forms of Scooby-Doo marketing and merchandise, and have all been turned into various figures. The famous line uttered by criminals was first heard in this episode, although they weren't yet considered meddling.
Might have gotten away with it too. If it wasn't for these blasted kids and their dog.
Thanks for watching this week's The Myth Behind the Monsters. Tune in next time when we take a look at The Mummy. And if you want more Halloween haunts from Dracula and Frankenstein, come back tomorrow as we take a look at Rockula and Frankenstone, continuing our 60th anniversary celebration of the Flintstones. What did you think about the Universal monsters? Are you going to check out the original films this Halloween? If you're interested, they are all featured on the Internet Archive. They're not necessarily the best quality, but they're free, so I can't complain. Let us know down below. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Cheers. Thanks for watching Tube of Tunes. If you want more from the channel, hit subscribe. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on, follow us on our socials. Hope you liked it. Cheers.